Yes, I agree with you that childhood means a tremendous lot. I always go back to that thought, even now, after so many years. And I think what means a lot, too, are several people, several principal impressions connected to certain people. I'm not trying to show how old I am, but you will see it along the way. But I will tell you that I'm of such an age that I remember Maxim Gorky quite well. To tell the truth, I remember him well just once. In my mind's eye, I have a clear memory of him. My father and I came to visit him. Gorky liked my father a lot, and he had discovered my father in my father's youth. Back before the World War I, Gorky published his stories in one of his Gorky collections. My father, my mother, with whom Gorky became friends later, my brother and I came to visit him and spent quite a few hours in his house. When he returned from Italy, he was given several rather luxurious houses. One of them was a real palace opposite the Nikolina Hill. Later it was the government's reception house. I remember Gorky well. He seen us off were leaving. He went outside. He's standing somewhere by a marble staircase leading to that palace, and he's standing next to a potted palm tree. And my childhood memory is that he is taller than that palm tree. In fact, it must have been not the case, but I'm a boy, I'm 4, 5 at most. And Gorky is very tall and very lean, and that impression of verticality was very strong. I won't exaggerate. I didn't have a feeling that here was a great man, but it was the impression of an incredibly tall man. And as regards greatness, I knew he wasn't to be disturbed, and of course, I was already becoming wicked and mischievous, and I had to break the injunction. Gorky's study was on the 2nd floor, and it was forbidden to run around there. But as soon as the opportunity presented itself during one of our visits, I ran up the staircase. I remember well it was dark around me, because the lights weren't turned on for the visitors not to approach Gorky's studies in the evenings. And I ran through the darkness towards the lamp where Gorky was sitting. But at that very moment, somebody snatched me away. So I don't remember Gorky at his desk, but I remember running up close. I don't think he was angry. In general, he treated me humorously. It's rather funny, I still have the letter he wrote to me and my brother. It was the last year of Gorky's life. He had a birthday party, and my parents went to that celebration. He had another palace in the Crimean Tessel. I had never been there, but my parents did stay there for long stretches of time. And when they went to the birthday party, my brother and I drew a picture each. We were both keen on drawing. My brother became an artist while I didn't. By the way, when my brother already was a professional artist, he praised my drawings highly. He said I was drawing best when I was around 3, then my art went downhill. That picture was done after my art had already gone downhill, so it was not an abstract painting, but it had a subject. I drew what I thought was a yard dog with its chain. And Gorky writes in his letter, "What a marvelous drawing you did of a little devil with a bundle of pretzels." I was very upset. I thought, here he was, such a smart man, and he couldn't understand it was not a little devil at all, it was a dog. And those weren't pretzels at all, it was a chain. I didn't think I did a bad drawing. I thought Gorky didn't get it. So there was this mutual misunderstanding. Be it as it may, I still have that letter, and that's very nice. Besides Gorky himself, I knew many people around him, whom he gathered around him, people close to him, who lived in his household. There were women he had been close with at various times, and there were some men, sometimes very odd ones. Undoubtedly, oddness, which comes through in many Gorky's characters too, attracted Gorky greatly. I was most friendly with an artist by name of Ivan Nikolaevich Rakitsky. He had the nickname Nightingale. In Gorky's house, all the household members had nicknames. The Nightingale liked me because I studied history and geography, and he held something like a test for me, and I passed it. And then he and I went through some books of my father's, and Rakitsky was pleased with that too. And then we talked a lot. And once, several years after Gorky's death, I came to that palace on the Nikolina Hill. Rakitsky was a keeper, a caretaker of that museum, which nobody visited. Gorky's family still lived there, his son's widow and Gorky's granddaughters, who were friends of mine. Strictly speaking, it was them my brother and I visited. The Nightingale was a kind of a keeper of that museum, and once he told me, I will show you something that people don't usually see. And he took me to the room, to the chambers where Gorky had lain dying. He told me, now I will show you something you must remember. And he showed me the newspapers Gorky had read. Every morning Gorky read many newspapers, because, as we knew even later from the experience of the Soviet life, newspapers lied horribly. But one could glean something by reading many newspapers. The lies in Izvestia, the news, were slightly different from the lies in Pravda, the truth. Komsomolka lies differed in their own way, and by comparing them, one could find something. Gorky had certainly discovered that, and he subscribed to all those newspapers. And Rakitsky showed me that during the 2 weeks of Gorky's illness before his death, the country was being prepared for his death. Every newspaper carried an official bulletin on Gorky's health. He was kept unawares. For him, a single copy of each newspaper was published without those official bulletins. That is, he was not to know that the country was being prepared for what I think was the murder of Gorky. But of course, Gorky was not to know what was about to be done to him. Initially, his illness was not serious at all. I won't go into details now. I wrote about it, and some people disagree with me, but there are many problems surrounding Gorky's last years and even days, and surrounding what had been going on in his family. Who were the people around him? I know it rather well, because my father remained one of his closest entourage. Gorky wanted my father to help him in the newly set up Writers' Union and in many other affairs. It was apparent to my father sometimes, it might have just seemed to him, but be it as it may, sometimes Gorky would let him know something unusual about his view on the country and on what was happening to the country. Of course, Gorky would do it indirectly through hints, or by giving my father a book with some passages specifically marked. Once my father came to visit Gorky and saw Bukharin. Gorky and Bukharin were discussing the project of setting up a non-party newspaper which would write the truth. They were discussing involving intelligentsia in the project, etc. Such projects were many. Gorky was close to such opposition members as Bukharin, Rykov, Radek, and it's almost without doubt that Stalin wouldn't have succeeded in organizing those public trials where everybody confessed, and as we know, confessed under torture, to trumped-up charges of being spies, etc. Gorky would have exposed at least some part of that lie. So I think it was not a coincidence that Gorky's murder occurred right before those trials, because when Gorky decided to return, he hadn't understood how dangerous Stalin was. And during those years he spent in Russia, he understood what was going on. And in many ways, he had a very negative attitude to the regime. He understood things were very wrong in the country. And that's why his death was a part of that overall tragedy of the years 1936, 1937. I will talk about my father a bit later, because my growing up, my interest in scholarship, my reading are mostly connected with him. First of all, I would like to talk about my mother. Mother was beautiful. She was a young actress. It was from her that I heard many enthusiastic, inspired stories about the 1920s, about the ebullience of artistic life and about the ebullience of life in general in the 1920s. She was an actress of the Meyerhold Theater, and I think that Meyerhold was first and foremost impressed by her wonderful looks, her loud voice, etc. She wasn't just an actress of the Meyerhold Theater, she was also a student of his at the central courses for directors. And every evening she would be returning home from her classes at those central courses for directors. She would be taking the rather empty and still dangerous streets of the post-Civil War Moscow. She would be coming back with her fellow students, with a girl who was a friend of hers, with Eisenstein and Yudkevich. It was a time when each of them had their own perception of art. Each of them was joining the entirely new art that was being created before their very eyes. And Meyerhold himself produced an indelible impression on my mother. She spoke about his amazing qualities as an actor. He would show them how they were to act. At the time, he wasn't acting anymore himself, but he would show them how to act. And sometimes, while doing that, he would somersault across the entire stage. It was an incredible mastery of the acting technique, which he also demanded that they develop. So they all did biomechanics. They worked a lot on proper diction. They even had some music classes. My mother had gone through that schooling, which later certainly helped her. My mother came from a merchant family, which wasn't particularly rich, but in the merchant milieu around them there were some very wealthy people, millionaires even. According to my mother, our immediate ancestors were serfs who were liberated from serfdom during the emancipation of peasants, and they came to Moscow from Nizhny Novgorod in their best shoes. They founded textile works, which later became a textile factory. The factory belonged to my grandfather, my mother's father. The workers liked him. After the revolution, he was elected the Red Director, so apparently he didn't exploit his workers. He died soon of cancer. His life was rather short. He was an unhappy man. My grandmother, my mother's mother, met her true love when she was already a mature person. In merchant families, girls were married off without asking for their consent. My grandmother hadn't known my grandfather, and it hadn't been her decision, it had been her parents' decision. My grandmother longed to have an education, as did my mother, and being a woman, she couldn't receive a regular higher education. And my mother and my grandmother, the junior and senior generations of women in our family, would come to this very building, to the Chernyaevsky University, to attend lectures. And among the lecturers, there was a young historian of law, Professor Boris Ivanovich Siromyatnikov. He was not only a scholar, he was also a public figure, an eminent figure in the cadet party. And once my grandmother said to my mother, "Tamara, I need your advice." They had a family council. My mother was only 17, and she had to decide whether my grandmother was right in deciding to leave my grandfather for this Boris Ivanovich, with whom she had fallen in love. He was also leaving his family, his children. And they lived happily ever after. So it was the correct decision. Boris Ivanovich's life was far from being easy. He remained true to his convictions. He disliked the Bolsheviks intensely. He would say that he would not take the metro. And in general, he wished to have nothing to do with them. So he couldn't practice his profession, which was the history of law. What's funny is that he had also been unsuitable for the Tsarist regime as well. He wrote a dissertation in the very liberal cadet spirit. Its typesetting was preserved, and many copies were published, but it was proscribed. And I apologize for this detail in the spirit of today's literature. But when my grandmother would come to stay with us for a while, she would bring certain supplies of paper to be used as toilet paper. And it was that very unfortunate dissertation by Boris Ivanovich, which dissertation was piled up in huge quantities on their shelves. That was how I encountered the first examples of what later would be termed samizdat. I encountered it for the first time in the toilet. As every regular intelligentsia member, Siromyatnikov did things that displeased the government. He was really an example of clear resistance. But here is a funny paradox of his life. When he could teach, there was among his students the young Vyshinsky. Later, Vyshinsky became a real scoundrel, you know. It was the person who was responsible for many things that happened at those horrible trials. By the way, I'm sure that Stalin used him, knowing full well that Vyshinsky hated the Bolsheviks. Vyshinsky wasn't with the Bolsheviks. He had been against them, and he had even been sentenced to some petty fines in the beginning of the Soviet time. And I think that the thing I'm going to talk about, the thing that happened after Vyshinsky, was so heavily promoted was not entirely accidental. Imagine he remembered his professor in the history of law, and during the last years of his life, Sarametnikov was able to practice his profession in the Institute for Law, and he even published a book on Peter I, which incurred severe wrath of Marxist historians. It was written in the spirit of Sarametnikov's erstwhile thoughts. It was Vyshinsky's patronage. So the worst and the best were incredibly intermingled at the time. And it's very difficult to sort it all out now. I think that it was precisely thanks to my mother that I received a classical Russian education, upbringing in the spirit of the people who belonged to the wealthier class in the old Russia. That is, I had French governesses, and I had a nanny who connected me to the country, to Russia. The nanny was a remarkable person. She hailed from the village of Martimyanova of the Tula region. The majority of her extended family was persecuted during the repressions against the kulaks. The nanny had already been living in Moscow by that time. She had left that village fairly early, and she tried to help move to Moscow those few relatives of hers who hadn't been exiled. It was because of her and of her relatives that I learned fairly early of what had happened to our peasants. Later I learned about it from other people too, certainly, but that was the most intimate and the most immediate. She told a lot about her childhood. She had attended a village school, and she would say that the local landowner, who was a very good man, helped them all and helped their education. She told me a lot about him, which contradicted the things that at the time we normally read or heard on the radio about landowners. By the way, later I lived in Peredelkino, the writer's town, and there I met among the peasants the house servants who remained from the time of the landowners. In Peredelkino there had been the Samarin estate from the well-known Samarins. One of them was a Slavophile, who is mentioned in Pasternak's poems, and probably the last Samarin was a prototype of Dr. Zhivago. I heard a story about him from that house servants of the Samarins. So later I learned many things that confirmed that attitude I had first learned about from my nanny. That in fact, in many villages there was no antagonism between peasants and landowners. And the relations between young landowners and young peasants were almost friendly. My nanny was a religious person. I think she was a true believer. Religion and holy books meant a lot for her. She read a lot, but she particularly liked reading holy books. And in the end of the war, a few churches were opened in Moscow. They were few, but they were indeed opened. It was an Easter celebration, and the nanny took my older brother Misha and me to that celebration. In my not so tender age, and I remember the first impression of a church I got, it was because so very many people crowded the church. The churches were few, and it was already the time of particular interest to it. And the first feeling was not only of festivity, but of an incredible congestion, and of how difficult it was physically, because there were too many people, even for a fairly large cathedral. It was a church of the joy for all the sorrowers. Later, I came to it a few times with my nanny. I could tell what a remarkable and true person in her own way my nanny was from the story of how she preserved Babel's books. Babel was close with my mother. They never got married. Babel went back to his family in France after being with my mother for a while. My mother was pregnant. My older brother, who later became an artist, is Babel's son. But as an artist, he had my father's last name. He was Mikhail Ivanov, because he virtually never knew Babel. While staying with us, Babel became very friendly with the nanny, who looked after little Misha before taking charge of me later. When Babel was leaving our home, he gave all the books he had to her as a present. And she kept them in a little chest. The chest sat in the corner where she lived. It was next to the kitchen. She didn't have a room of her own. We were fairly well off, but we didn't have enough rooms for everybody. And in that corner of hers, she preserved all of Babel's books. And when it was already possible to mention him, when it was already known he would be rehabilitated, she produced those books and gave them to me, and I passed them on to my brother. It was difficult for her psychologically to give them directly to my brother, because of so many problems with his name, which she apparently didn't want to discuss with him, even though he knew he wasn't, as people now say in the West, my father's biological son. But in essence, he didn't consider himself a mere adoptee. I think that thus preserving Babel's books was not only a gesture of a firm and brave person, because after all, one could have paid dearly for it, but it was also connected with the fact that those books meant a lot for her. She read a lot and knew the writers who visited us. With some of them she was even friends. Irakli Andronikov loved her dearly. He was almost like a son to my parents. After a short arrest in connection with the Beryut's case in the early 1930s, he moved from Leningrad to Moscow, and for a while he stayed with us in our apartment. And he remained a very close friend of our family. He had a separate, very close friendship with my nanny. Later, she would convince Andronikov to go to the village of Martimyanova for summer, to have some vacation there and to live a real life. When Andronikov's youngest daughter, Manana, a friend of mine, when she was little, she would say ironically about a mixture of ethnicities in their family. She would say, I'm not Jewish, I'm not Georgian, I'm Martimyanovian. There was something that attracted us all to my nanny, to her relatives, to the places where they lived. I think it was some profound refinement and decency, the quality that was peculiar for the Russian intelligentsia. I liked listening to her opinions. I didn't provoke her, but she would venture them on her own. An acquaintance of mine would come to visit. Some of them later actually became my friends. And when they left after having tea with me, she would tell me her opinion about them. I was struck by the accuracy of her observations. She gave the following opinion of a friend of mine, who later became a very close friend indeed. And she phrased it in a very interesting way. the wording wasn't correct, but in essence, it showed me what she thought of him. You can see at once she'd say, he's from the clergy. He wasn't from the clergy. He did have a beard, and he looked a typical Russian. And she liked being able to think of him in the terms of her childhood, her youth. It was Vladimir Nikolaevich Toporov. And what is remarkable is that he is the author of the recently written and published two-volume book, The Russian Saints. That is, my nanny sensed something about him that linked him to that very clergy, not only through his beard, not only through his appearance, but linked him to that very clergy in something very essential. Andronikov didn't just move to Moscow from Leningrad. He virtually fled Leningrad. He had been arrested along with the close friends of his, the Bereuts, Harms, Vidensky, who are famous now. It was their first arrest. Andronikov spent the shortest time in custody, and as his daughter told me, it appeared that Kirov might have interceded on his behalf. It was before Kirov's assassination. Andronikov was released, but he was traumatized for life. Now some documents related to the first arrest of the Bereuts are published, and they show that Andronikov behaved honorably. And you know, it's a striking fact. I think sometimes that details from everyday life say the most about people and their possibilities and merits. Most of the Bereuts perished. Harms and Vidensky never returned. After doing extremely hard time in a hard-time labor camp, Zabolotsky returned. By the way, Fadeev interceded on his behalf. Fadeev then headed the Writers' Union. And when Zabolotsky returned, he had no place to live in Leningrad. And he had no place to live in Moscow either. And Andronikov, an old friend of his from Leningrad, suggested that Zabolotsky stay with Andronikov's family. I don't exaggerate. They had a private apartment which measured 11 square meters or 100 square feet. It was at Собачья площадка near Arbat. It housed Irakli, his wife, Viva. They were like family members to us. Their two daughters, Manani and Erka. The nanny, who was connected to us via Martimyanovo. And it was to that 11 square meters into that family that Zabolotsky moved in on Irakli's offer, and Zabolotsky stayed for a while there. It amazes me that people were so little concerned about their own comfort. And besides everything else, it was also brave of them, because Zabolotsky was straight from the camps. The year is 1944. He got early release, but you imagine that it was still very scary. Since I will speak about Pasternak later on, I will mention something in this connection too. Irakli told me about a remarkable visit from Pasternak, who came to have a talk with Zabolotsky, whom he valued highly, as he did value the Bereuts in general. He liked their unusual manner of writing, which didn't imitate him, unlike many others. It was something new. And they began arguing about Khlebnikov, what kind of poet Khlebnikov was. For Zabolotsky, he was the best Russian poet. Pasternak argued he was influenced by Khlebnikov too at one point. But in the course of the argument, Pasternak kept quoting by heart lines and whole poems. And Zabolotsky said, "Why are you arguing? You yourself know him by heart." I think that I can speak with certainty on my earliest childhood and on what came afterwards, and what was the difference between the two. The first period lasted about until the time when I was around 6, up until when I was 5 years old plus. And my early childhood was for me and for all my young friends, for my brother and for everybody around me, the time of tumultuous pastimes, of keen interest in what can be broadly termed sports or physical exercises. We attended calisthenics classes at the scholar's house. We did various exercises which we thought very interesting. We rollerbladed a lot. It was everybody's passion then. Later, it totally disappeared, and I was very surprised to discover it in Europe. And then it arrived in Russia again from Europe. I remember a bridge in Paris near the Notre Dame Cathedral, and people rollerblade that bridge and virtually fly up into the air. They have competitions there. And we had something of the sort when I was a kid. We showed off before each other. It was a wild, tumultuous life. Life head over heels, quite literally, too. I remember once I stacked a chair upon a chair and a little table upon that, and I climbed up and managed to tell my brother, "Look how high I climbed." And I flopped down. My relatives ran in, alerted by the noise. They were horrified because I was lying on the floor bleeding. I had a scar on my head. Those were the passions of my early childhood. Everything stopped abruptly. Everything was over overnight. We were in the Crimea, in Koktebel. It was my father's favorite place, and he described it in a wonderful Koktebel tale of his. And we went into the mountains, and suddenly I couldn't walk any longer. My leg began to hurt, and it wouldn't stop hurting. I had to be taken to various doctors, and in the long run they told my mother it was very serious. They thought it was bone tuberculosis. I say they thought because the final diagnosis is still unclear. Anyway, it was dangerous at the time. There were no medications for tuberculosis. Many died on that disease. One had to go to a specialized sanatorium for children. My mother was afraid of it because of what had happened to several children we knew well. Kornei, Chukovsky, and others lost their children in such sanatoriums. And my mother begged the doctors to allow me to remain home. But home meant a dacha, because I needed fresh air. We managed to receive a dacha thanks to Gorky. That was during the last years of his life. At the time, Gorky managed to have a writer's dacha town set up. It was in Peredelkino, and we settled there, and I still live there since 1935. I'm the oldest Peredelkino resident now. Leonov competed with me, but alas, he is no longer with us. And compared to us, the rest are newcomers. And so I lay there amidst the fresh air. I was tied up hand and foot, I couldn't move. That is, I could move my arms just to take something, I could read books, but I couldn't lift my arm. It was tied up here. It was, instead of a cast, a relative improvement. It would have been more difficult in a cast. I spent 2 years immobile like that. Then I relearned to walk, and then I walked with crutches, and I had a very thick sole on one of the shoes so that the foot wouldn't touch the floor. Physically, life changed entirely, particularly against the background of the impetuous and wild sports in the beginning. And then it all broke off, it all stopped. And what was there instead? Sheer reading. Reading on a grandiose scale, because all that energy went into reading and learning something. I had to expand my strength somehow, and there was no other way. Speransky, a wonderful pediatrician whose acquaintance my parents had made also via Gorky, once said to my mother as a consolation, "Tamara Vladimirovna, don't be upset. If it weren't for this illness, he would have become a soccer player. Now he'll become a scholar." To a degree, he was right. I don't know whether he was right about soccer players, but he was right about the scholar. My father tried to scrounge up interesting books. It was easy for him then. We received lists of books to be published monthly, and one could circle the titles. Later, I figured what it cost him, as did my entire illness. He paid dearly in the physical sense. It meant he had to do extra work to write articles for newspapers. It was in fact hard. Anyway, he bought me tons of books. I had piles of them, literally piles of books mounted next to my bed. And I read them rather quickly. They were in a variety of subjects. And during those 2 years of being bedridden, the subsequent years, I read more than probably during many following years. And I think that it was one of the principal stimuli for what followed. Another impulses came from people around me, and from my father first and foremost. I think that my father's influence was the principal determining factor in my life in all respects, and in scholarship first and foremost. Although I dreamed of becoming a writer, and during my entire life I kept writing poetry, even if it's only now that I'm going to publish it in several books. Still, my father's influence was the greatest in my scholarly pursuits, and in my life as a whole. He was a remarkable and unusual person in many respects. To begin with, his origins are to a degree mysterious. You know that the last name of Ivanov is sort of not real, because Baron Kaufman, who conquered Turkestan and built the new Tashkent, had a housekeeper who had an illegitimate son by an unknown father. And Baron Kaufman's aide-de-camp, the General Ivanov, adopted him. The boy who had been given Ivanov's name was my grandfather. Generally speaking, according to the unwritten rules of the Tsarist army, a general was not supposed to cover up his own sin. That's a rare occasion, as in Pierre Bezukhov's story. Usually the sins of a senior officer would be covered up. Hence the legend that maybe Vsevolod Ivanov was in fact Baron Kaufman. Olga Dmitrievna Forsh, a prominent writer, would say in the 1920s, "Vsevolod Ivanov is such a brave man, all others give up their titles, and he credits himself with a title which likely wasn't his." She said that because he mentioned his legend in some authorized autobiographical essay of his. Other family ties are more apparent. We have Polish blood. My grandmother on my father's side was a daughter of a Polish exile who married a Kazakh woman. So we are a real mix of the West and the East. The Kazakh element showed very strongly in my father's appearance. There is a remarkable sculpted portrait of my father, made by a woman close to him, Sana Lebedeva. I think it's in the Tretyakov gallery now. In that portrait, you can see clearly those Mongol wrinkles round his eyes. Later in his life, his face possibly became more round and less clearly Mongol-looking, but it was definitely there. And I think that even more than his outward appearance, his character in his youth took shape under the influence of his great interest in the Orient and great knowledge of the Orient. He was born in what is now Kazakhstan. It was West Siberia then, the village of Lebezhye in the Semipalatinsk region, which was then called a province. It was very close to that horrible site where the first nuclear tests were conducted. In his last years, my father very often visited the sites around his birthplace. But even though he was a well-known, a famous Soviet writer, he could never obtain permission to visit the place itself. Apparently, the site is still contaminated with radioactive materials, and it's dangerous to go there. So I do not complain. Maybe it was the right thing not to allow him to go there. The population was mixed there. There were Russians, Kazakhs, and others who lived with them in Kazakhstan. They were Orthodox, Muslims. My grandfather, that is my father's father, who had been General Ivanov's adopted son, taught at a village professional school. He was friends with the Muslim priests, the mullahs, who taught him Arabic and Persian. And in my father's archive, we still have the beautifully written calligraphic Arabic and Persian texts. And my grandfather valued this knowledge very highly. He went to Moscow, which wasn't very easy then because of the great distances. He passed correspondence course tests at the Lazarev Institute for Oriental Languages in the Armyansky side street, where the Institute for Oriental Studies had been for a long time. And my grandfather received the right to wear the Lazarev Institute uniform. And strictly speaking, that was all he got. He went back and continued teaching at the same professional school, but he had the right to wear that honorary uniform. And everybody acknowledged his command of Oriental languages. In the meantime, my father continued with his interest in the Orient, but of all the various Oriental cultures and traditions, it was Indian that dominated his interests. Later, my father wrote a novel titled "We're on Our Way to India." He was on his way to India for his entire youth. He left his family. There was a similarity between him and Gorky, which Gorky appreciated, and the similarity consisted in the fact that he had many years of travel. He was a vagabond too in his own way. He traveled on foot through the entire Asian part of Russia, and he made his living with the help of various skills, of which the public was most attracted by the Oriental magician Ben Ali Bey. We still have posters advertising the Oriental magician Ben Ali Bey performing in a circus. He pierced himself with swords, and I would ask him how he did it. And he would answer that for the most part that was a trick. It was a very cleverly conceived trick, but a trick nonetheless. Still, some things were real. For instance, there was real training in yoga. He was very serious about it. Later, I even found proof in his archive. There were 5 books published in about 1910-1911, which he then bought and used as manuals on yoga. Apparently, he had rather good abilities in what we now call parapsychology. For instance, he told me he would send real texts, long texts at that, to a friend of his by name of Petka Zakharov, who later emigrated. My father wrote him a poem. you could have become a great scientist, so that even Mendeleev was afraid to speak before you. And you are gallivanting around gambling dens, turning life into a silly fairy tale. And this young man, before turning to gambling dens, which is now so common that it's strange to think that this pursuit could have brought about surprising criticisms. But at those times, Mendeleev was a more attractive figure. So this Petka Zahara would send him back at an appointed hour a long text. He would send it mentally by straining his psyche and via the mail. And they would write down the time, and they did it several times, and each time they both received certain texts. And they would write them down. It was a carefully set up experiment. I think these things are absolutely real. Today there are many people doing it. It's another matter that we don't know the mechanism, but something of the sort exists. It's somehow connected apparently with other realms of creativity and mysticism, which so far remain a mystery. And all those facets of my father's soul were, I think, very pronounced. What is interesting that it was combined with fairly strong rational capabilities of a scientific nature. A rare combination, a rare mix. He was not simply a good writer. He had startling images which immediately introduced him into the circle of the best writers. When Gorky invited him to Petrograd, he received recognition very quickly. And his friends, the Serapion brothers, Fedin, Zoshchenko, Tikhonov, they immediately acknowledged him as a major writer. And at the same time, he had the gift of insight, certain depth, which rarely goes together with that. But I think what's particularly interesting from that point of view is that aspect of his youthful yoga pursuits and those experiments of his, which he brilliantly described in the book Adventures of an Oriental Magician. Unfortunately, only 3 parts are written out of the intended 5. In 1936, the third part was critically mauled as being formalist, you know. That was the time when Stalin cracked down on Shostakovich, calling his works a mess instead of music, and continuing with the publication of the book at the time was impossible. In Adventures of an Oriental Magician, particularly in the third part, my father describes a unique experience of his communication with nature, when he followed exactly the rules of the real yoga. He abstained from meat, he ate little in general. In his youth, he didn't drink alcohol at all. Only after coming to Petrograd, to Moscow, and after he started socializing with writers that equal footing. But in his youth, he led a very modest life, and he didn't break any rules. He led a true ascetic life in the Indian sense of the word. He didn't even take baths. That was also a rule of the classical asceticism. Buddha is known not to have taken a bath for 2 years prior to achieving enlightening. He did take a bath before enlightening, achieving enlightening. When my father went through all those trials, he lived in a village at the outskirts of a forest, and in the evening he would go out into a clearing. He noted a place where he would sit down on a tree stump and he would wait for midnight. At midnight, animals would come out to him from the thick of the forest. They would approach him, sniff at him as if he was one of them. They weren't afraid of him. The most amazing thing, as he would tell me later, was that not only did he feel his kinship with animals, as I apparently sensed too, but also that he seemed to hear the grass grow. He had a sense of a certain unity with plants as well. It turned out to be very fragile. When he fell in love and broke some of the ascetic rules, In a few weeks, he came to the same clearing after a good meal and after a good bath and so on. And he sat down on the same tree stump, and not a single animal approached him. And he no longer had that feeling of unity with nature and plants. Like any other mystical feeling, it comes and goes, and it's very difficult to preserve it. But I tend to think that, to a large degree, he had it in him to experience these somewhat weird mystical sensations. These experiences intensified significantly in the last month of his life. His last months were very harsh. He had a very good heart, and he had cancer. It metastasized. My father was at the Kremlin hospital at the Rublovskaya highway, and a doctor there told me, "Your father has a truly athletic constitution, but that was the reason for him to suffer more, because it prolonged his suffering. His body wouldn't die, and the illness was horrific." And at that time, he had a series of mystical visions. He saw Buddha, and he relayed to me his conversation with Buddha. Usually he would say that he had a dream, but it was a dream that was a kind of vision. At that point, he didn't even tell me it was a dream. He said he had a conversation and used the Buddhist term for Buddha. He called him Bodhisattva, which literally means a creature that attained enlightening, awakening. Bodhi had the same root as the Russian verb budit, to wake up. Bodhi is also the awakened one. Buddha is also the awakened one, but Bodhisattva is an awakened creature. He told me I spoke with the Bodhisattva, and he told me it was a gigantic Buddha, as tall as the Moscow University high-rise building. From the window of that Kremlin hospital where he spent his last months, one could see Moscow in the distance, and the university building on the Lenin Hills, as the district was called then. And that gigantic Buddha seemed to have moved from Moscow towards the hospital and came up to the window of my father's ward. So my father saw him through the window, and he spoke to him, to that gigantic statue. The statue was quite real for him, because he wrote a story, The Return of the Buddha, where such a gigantic statue is described. You know, it's the kind of statues as the Taliban destroyed in Afghanistan, and the Russian archaeologists, such as Litvinsky, found in the Central Asia, in the formerly Soviet Central Asia, in Tajikistan, in Uzbekistan, in the lands of Fergana and in Bactria. So those dreams or visions were quite realistic. Buddha spoke on glory and destiny. It was a topic of particular concern for my father, because he started out as a famous writer. Then he was nearly forgotten because his best works, like that very same The Return of the Buddha, were out of print for decades, or they weren't published after drastic revisions due to censorship. And then Buddha told him it was okay. He told my father not to pay attention. Everything will be understood somehow in time. And my father was to see that the important thing was that he had written it. Later I wrote a poem where I wrote down these conversations with my father in quite many details. And there are these lines on that vision of Buddha Bodhisattva. You are speaking to Bodhisattva, and your eyes see him in the gloom. Your fields with unharvested crops are blessed by this deity. He arrives to you as a high-rise building and speaks on glory and destiny. Maybe the laugh was a task set by him, as you were told in your early childhood. Of course, my father had a lot of Buddhist books at home in Russian translation. He had all the books by Shcherbatskoy, the great Russian scholar of the Buddhist philosophy. He knew several languages of the Buddhism. He knew Tibetan, Sanskrit, etc. So it's difficult for me to arrive at a final answer, mostly because we don't know what language we should speak to such personalities or images. But I think that for my father, Russian was the natural language for all his exalted thoughts and for his thoughts on Buddhism. My father had quite a few notes on Buddhism, and one wartime note, which I think is included in his recently published diaries, is that, in the final analysis, Buddhism is the most profound of all the teachings known to us, but all that is written after reading Buddhist texts in Russian translation. So allow for somebody translating those texts for him into Russian. Maybe the translation was done inside him. He had a very interesting dream connected to Akhmatova. Later I described it to her, and she saw in it a mixture of some of the real conversations with two of her poems. And the story of her son, Gumilov Jr., was inserted in that dream. The story of the time when he was still jailed, at the end of that entire period. They were fighting with great difficulty to have him released. And all that found its way into that dream. It was a mixture of reality, of the surrounding things, and of some strikingly odd and surprising visions. I think it was very indicative of him as a writer. His best works have those features. For instance, his wonderful early story, The Return of the Buddha. It is a story of a large statue of Buddha that was in St. Petersburg, and after the revolution it was being returned to the Central Asia. But on the way it is damaged, some expensive parts are stolen, and both the statue and the scholar of the Orient who accompany the statue back home, they both perish. This book is fraught with quotes from Buddhist texts, which my father studied at the time, and from the Russian translation of ancient Chinese poets, whom he loved. Other works of his are less openly exotic, but they have their fair share of the fantastic, which made it difficult to fit it into the regular Russian literature. Russian literature is largely realistic. There were writers such as Platonov, particularly in his later works such as John, and Bulgakov. I use the term fantastic realism for that, like Latin American magical realism of Marquez. I think that what really appeared in those years was not the social realism that has been so much talked about, but that very fantastic realism which was very interesting. My father was one of those fantastic realists, together with the Serapion brothers, to whom he belonged. In 1923, several young writers, my father, Fedin, who was a Serapion brother too, and Pilnyak, who at the time was a friend of my father's, and also he wrote in a way like my father. So these three writers were invited to read one work each to the leaders of the time, to the members of the government. Lenin was ill and was absent, everybody else was there. The readings were held at one of the daches of the government members. My father chose a story with a fairly scary plot. I won't retell it, but this plot involved a bloody story of a murder of a child, because this child is a child of a Kazakh Kazakh and Kyrgyz were often confused at the time. So this is a child of a Kazakh and Kyrgyz wet nurse who was seized to bring up a regiment's adoptee. The Red guerrilla fighters had killed an officer of the White Army and his woman companion, and the child had survived. And a Kazakh wet nurse with her child was seized in a raid on a Kazakh village, and then it was decided she underfed the Russian child. The children were weighed, and the Kyrgyz child weighed more, and they killed the child. That was the plot of the story, The Wee Child, which my father decided to read to the Soviet leaders. Even at the time, it was an action of incredible, almost senseless bravery. Look at the way he portrays the Red guerrilla fighters. After the reading was over, my father was standing by a tree in the garden, and there were many groups of writers and statesmen talking to each other. And someone approached my father from behind and put something heavy in his right and left pockets. And he said, "Here's good wine from the Caucasus for you, as a reward for a very good story." The man spoke with a heavy accent. My father knew nothing about him until then. It was this then People's Commissar on the Ethnic Affairs. Nobody knew he was the Secretary General of the Communist Party, because at the time it was an administrative bureaucratic office, a trifling position. People's Commissar for Ethnic Affairs was on the contrary an important office. And as the Commissar, he took that story of a Kyrgyz child quite well. And he said, "I have here an opportunity to invite you to my dacha. I'm alone at the moment. We will spend a couple of days together. You will tell me. I have a lot of good wine from the Caucasus. We'll drink." My father accepted the invitation. They spent some time there, and afterwards they met quite often for a while, had a drink together. Stalin drank a lot, but he drank nothing but wine. At the time, my father broke his self-imposed prohibition mostly because of his friendship with Yesenin, whom he saw almost daily. Yesenin drank every day, and in the end, it became a problem for my father. But at the time, it wasn't much of a problem. He was young, and meeting with Stalin continued up until a certain point. When Stalin came to see Voronsky, a party official whom Lenin entrusted with overseeing party relations with writers, payments to writers, and so on. Voronsky gave Stalin the proofs of my father's new book, his stories of the Central Asia, the breath of the desert. Stalin read it, gave the proofs back, and said he wanted very much to write a preface. And my father told Voronsky he didn't like prefaces much, especially those written by political figures. And that was it. The relationship was severed. Stalin forever had vindictive feelings about it. They met many years since at that famous meeting at Gorky's, where Stalin called writers engineers of human souls. Gorky never knew the history between them. My father never told him. So Gorky introduced these two seeming strangers to each other. And he said to Stalin, "This is Old Ivanov, a talented writer." Stalin said, "Yes, sure, I remember. You had an interesting book of stories on Central Asia." He hinted that he remembered that story. And afterwards, he let my father know several times, via different events, that he still remembered. He had an evil remembrance. And at that time, he never allowed to arrest my father. That question certainly arose, but I don't want to plunge you into very dark matters. Let's take Babil, for instance, who was my father's close friend even before they found themselves bound by complicated problems of family and kin. When Babil was arrested in 1939, they tortured him, demanding that he give testimony against my father. This is known from the letter Babil wrote to my brother Babil's son before being executed by the firing squad. The KGB general who was involved with rehabilitating Babil gave us the letter, so we know it. They demanded testimonies, but my father was never arrested. I think the explanation is that Stalin was angry and wanted to show he was angry. Soon after their friendship fell apart, Stalin called the editors of a magazine and said, "Why is Всеволод Ivanov publishing a work of a Semenovic kind, the landmark-changing kind?" My father immediately became an alien. At some meeting with writers, Stalin said that the Armored Train, the famous play after my father's novel, was a useful work, but it wasn't written by a Bolshevik. That is, my father clearly belonged to those writers who could be allowed into Soviet literature up to a certain point, but the overwhelming majority of his works was proscribed, like that story, The Wee Child. It was out of print for the entire Stalin time. Other works were published only posthumously. Two large novels, Kremlin and U, written in a grotesque, fantastic form. The novel Kremlin has a dragon among its characters, and the novel U describes a grotesque picture of Moscow at the time when the Cathedral of Christ the Savior was being demolished. My father's works weren't published, or else his old works were published in an altered form, and my father was very much grieved by not being published. I'm going through his archives now. We're planning to publish an entire volume of his previous unpublished works. And I see that on some manuscripts there are notes in his handwriting. I began this on such and such date, never finished, because there is no hope of publication. There was no hope of publication. There were difficulties, including financial ones, both for him and for the entire family. But at the same time, Stalin would never give permission for my father's arrest, wouldn't give what I would call a special hunting license. From Stalin's point of view, from his personal point of view, which meant a lot at the time, people like my father, Eisenstein, Pasternak, were important figures in art, literature, culture, and he wanted them to go down in history as people around him. An Oriental despot wants great people to go down in history as his courtiers. It's important for his grandeur, but at the same time, they must be kept at a distance. They're not being permitted. Fadeev, the head of the Writers' Union, told my father that when in 1939 writers were given awards and medals, Stalin said that Всеволод Ivanov was not to be given the Order of Lenin. He was to be given an order of the second rank, the Order of the Red Banner of Labor, since Всеволод Ivanov is an artful dodger. He must have had the thought that when Stalin was only fighting to get the power and wanted to write that preface, Всеволод Ivanov was an artful dodger and thought that maybe it would be better not to have Stalin as the author of the preface. The idea was that my father was an extremely cunning person who knows something, and it's better to be careful dealing with him. Be as it may, though, it made life possible for all of us, including me. And I'm sure that when I began to behave maybe in too willful a manner for my age, I was let off for a time, because I was the son of that very father who wasn't to be finished off entirely. In my adolescence and my youth, because I was very close with my father. I made an acquaintance and then became close friends with some people he was very close with, such as Mikhail Mikhailovich Zoshchenko. Like the entire country at the time, my brother, my sister, and I were absorbed in Zoshchenko's stories. I was very happy when, during a visit to Koktebel, already after my recovery from the illness and being bedridden, my father took me to see Zoshchenko. Zoshchenko normally lived in Leningrad, so we couldn't see him on a regular basis. We met then and became friends, despite the age difference. And an important episode in my life is connected with Zoshchenko. In March of 1944, Zoshchenko returns to Moscow from Alma-Ata, where he had been evacuated to. He was supposed to return to Leningrad, but for the time being it was impossible. So he stays at the Moscow hotel and invites my parents there. They take me along, and other Serbian brothers, such as Fedin, Slanimsky, also Leningrad writers, were there too. And he reads to us all a manuscript. It wasn't typed up. It was handwritten in thin notebooks. All those notebooks he read to us over several evenings. That was a manuscript of the book Before the Sunrise. For his entire life, Zoshchenko thought he was suffering from hypochondria. He was in a very grim mood. It's surprising that he was writing such funny stories. Later, I met other good writers of comic stories who weren't quite such funny men in real life. But Zoshchenko was a very grim person, and this grimness oppressed him as well. He wanted to get rid of it, and he worked on himself hard, trying to remember what could have happened in his life to have caused this permanent grimness. In a way, it was the influence of Freudianism, because in the long run, in that book, he arrives at an episode in his early childhood when he was scared by being bathed. And that scare was the first impetus in the direction of the fears in his later life. But regardless of Freudianism, the book is wonderfully written. He thought he had to make it known to everybody, since it was a way for getting rid of hypochondria, of melancholia, which afflicts many people. The book went into print, only the beginning was published, and then it was proscribed. The hounding of Zoshchenko began. And the book was never fully published during his lifetime. He gave the manuscript to my mother for safekeeping. It was published many years since. The title of the second part was changed, by the way. It's now titled The Book on Reason. The title wasn't originally there. The title was given to ease the censorship process. And Before the Sunrise is the beginning of the human life, when the person is being shaped, and all the future fears and so on appear first. After the persecutions, Zoshchenko went back to Leningrad, and his works were published again. But alas, his books provoked Stalin's wild anger, and the Central Committee's decree against Zoshchenko appeared. He was persecuted in every possible way. They not only stopped publishing him, but he was also stripped of his bread coupons, which brought about horrible psychological consequences. He feared he wouldn't be able to provide his family, his wife and son, and other people close to him with money and food. He began to eat less. He had never been a reveler and an overeater. And when I would meet him in the years before his death, he died in 1958, He virtually couldn't eat at all. He developed that illness. Its scientific name is anorexia nervosa. When a person stops eating, it's what killed Gogol. Gogol is a striking parallel. He was also a combination of deep hypochondria and brilliant humor. Apparently, they belong to the same type of person. And you know, once I spent an entire evening with Roshenko. We visited our mutual friends in Leningrad, and he told me, you know, he addressed me in a familiar way. You know, I seem to have started eating. I will put this piece of cheese, and you will see I'll eat it. And with difficulty, with an effort, he put this piece of cheese, and we spent the entire evening there, and he never touched it. For him, it was a huge problem. He struggled with himself, but he couldn't make himself eat. For us all, his fate was a great tragedy, and what had been done to him. And at the same time, he behaved heroically. You know, he wrote a letter to Stalin right after the Central Committee's decree. And he began it with the words, "Iosif Vissarionovich, you are mistaken. I'm sure that at the time it was the only document of its kind. Nobody dared write." He wrote that Stalin was mistaken, meaning that Zoshenko never intended to subvert the Soviet state with his story about a monkey, which is what he was accused of. I've already mentioned Boris Leonidovich Pasternak, among other people close to my father. He was my father's friend since 1920s. Pelnyak, who was a friend to both of them, introduced them to each other. And in Peredelkin, in the writer's dacha town, Pasternak for a while was Pelnyak's neighbor. When Pelnyak was arrested, Pasternak no longer wanted to live in the house and moved to the house next to ours. Since then, since 1937, we were neighbors up until his death. And it so happened that we lived in the same building in Moscow too. So we were neighbors in two ways. And besides, he and I gradually became friends, even though he belonged to my parents' generation. He was for me an example of a remarkable person. Even when I was a child, he treated my scholarly interests quite seriously. I remember him coming to visit us. And he addressed me in a familiar manner. Later, he addressed me in a formally polite way, though. But then he said to me in a familiar way, "I found a fossilized shell for you." They were then in abundance in Peredelkino, just lying around, remnants of the time when the Moscow region was the ocean floor. And I was then into paleontology, so it was important for me. And there were other cases like that. Pasternak had a very close friend, a lifelong friend, Valentin Ferdinandovich Asmus, a philosopher who then became friends with my parents too, came to visit us often, and later he took much interest in me and in my academic pursuits. One summer, he lent me a telescope and presented me with a calendar for an astronomer, with some information on how to observe astronomical events in a timely manner. He was the person I heard about mathematical logic from for the first time, and later I worked on it, partially using the books with his prefaces. Many of my academic engagements had been developed with the help of Asmus's interests, but the main stimulus came from my father first and foremost, because in addition to everything I have already said about him, to that unexpected combination of the irrational, the mystical on the one hand, and the rational on the other hand, was also characterized by his intensive and serious study of many branches of science. I would say that of all the sciences I was interested in my childhood, in my youth, and later too, there wasn't a single one in which my father wouldn't have a corresponding interest in. He talked to me on the subjects that would later interest me. It was because of him that I started to read Faber on insects, which interested me hugely for a while. When I was studying the sociology of ants and even tried to study anthills. And probably the most surprising thing about his interest in astronomy, where Asmus certainly was his greatest source too, is a recent discovery which makes me think about my father. One of the most recent discoveries in cosmology and astrophysics is that in the centers of galaxies, of the accumulations of nebulas and stars such as our Milky Way is, there are gigantic accumulations of matter which we don't see. We receive no information from those amazing places in the universe, but we know that there are huge amounts of matter of remarkable density. And we know that as a matter of principle we cannot see it. And as a matter of principle we cannot receive anything from there. One can in a way fall in there. It's quite possible. It's called a black hole. It's a relatively new discovery. It's being actively discussed now. But each time I read about how startling this discovery is, I recall that in about 1940, my father gave me a book on astronomy by Jeans in the Russian translation and told me, read this book. It has a particularly interesting thought that in the center of a galaxy there is something of high concentration. The term black hole didn't exist then. But Jeans used other words to write about it. What is surprising is that Jeans, a prominent English physicist, already at the time, on the basis of very limited data from natural sciences, could deduce it. And what is also surprising is that my father, with his keen intuition, understood the importance of this. For instance, in order to understand Einstein better, he studied higher mathematics, although he had 4 grades of school education, and then he became a vagabond. He read during his entire life. He amassed a huge library, and there are his notes in every book. Now I read some of his remarks, and I'm surprised that in the books on sociology, psychology, and various other sciences, there are very interesting remarks of his. He collected a large library in the 18th century in Russia. Many books burned down at our dacha, at our pre-war dacha burned down in Peredelkino. We had a huge library of a few thousand books there. What else I wanted to say about my father is that besides his interest in nature, in history, he collected many books on history, and he wrote on the Russian history himself a lot. And he has an interesting story on the Oriental history about the medieval Arab Caliphate and its relation with Byzantium. Besides all that, he had a great interest in and a keen understanding of the political situation of our time. Unlike most of the writers I met then, unlike his friends, his close friends, he felt keenly everything that went on in the world. I remember his reaction to the German occupation of the Czechoslovakia, to Munich, when France and England virtually gave Czechoslovakia up to Hitler. My father was so upset, he abandoned his habit of daily work, of writing something every day. It lasted about almost a month. He couldn't do anything. It was worse than an illness for him. I think that the great interest I had then in politics is connected with him. However funny it might sound, at the age of 11, I decided that the main occupation, the most serious one, after involvement with chemistry and chemical experiments, Tchaikovsky would say, God, what complex and dangerous experiments children are allowed to carry out. After being involved in chemistry, paleontology, and serious sciences like that, I had the idea that I was to be a politician and a diplomat. I started a notebook where I wrote down everything I considered interesting among the current political events. It was alphabetized, a standard little notebook, a little alphabetized notebook for addresses. And in that notebook, my mother once saw, Germany is a fascist dictatorship. Hitler is a dictator. The USSR is a dictatorship. Stalin is a dictator. Kalinin is a dummy president. My mother did a marvelous thing. She didn't tell me I was wrong. She took me to the garden. We knew all the conversations were being listened into both in the city at the dacha, that all the conversations were being recorded, and it was indeed the case. I was only recently invited to the Hotel Moscow as it was being demolished. I was taken to the room on the 9th floor, where my parents lived for a few months during the war. The TV people wanted to make a recording of me talking about my father, since his diaries has just been published, and these diaries had been written there. And when I came in, I saw a huge hole in the wall, and I asked what it was. That's where the recorder was. So we were indeed surrounded with that acoustic equipment. We saw it, we understood it, and we knew it. So my mother took me to the garden. We went quite far away from the house, and she told me, do you understand how dangerous what you wrote is? She never told me I was wrong. She never told me it wasn't true. We didn't discuss it. We discussed one thing only, what could have happened. That book was kept in the dining room in a drawer of a table. A radio set was sitting on top of the table. I heard what was being said on the radio, and I wrote it down. And so I kept that book there, because the government could change in some country, and I would immediately make corrections. It was an obvious pursuit. But she explained to me that any person who would enter the dining room could open the drawer by chance, open the book. And what would that person read there, and what would happen to us all afterwards? I went back and tore out the USSR page. I still have that book, but that page is not there. All other pages with the data are there, but not the USSR page. A significant influence in my childhood and in my youth, apart from my father's, was that of a remarkable person whom we would now call an eminent Soviet intelligence officer and a member of the Communist International, which was often the same thing then. His name was Boris Danilovich Mikhailov. Like many people from the same background, he was arrested and executed by the firing squad soon after World War II. And before that, though he did a lot, he worked abroad, created several communist parties, including the Communist Party of India. In India, he pretended to be Portuguese. He spoke many languages fluently, including Portuguese, so he could pass for a native speaker. He knew some Portuguese villages, so they couldn't nail him, even though he was interrogated. Moreover, he was tortured in one Indian state, where the Raja, the chief ruler, suspected him of being a spy from another country. He was arrested, put in a cage, and he had scars on his face. As he explained, those were left from the tortures he underwent. And even under torture, he continued to speak Portuguese and name all those fictitious addresses. So they never nailed him, and in a few months, they let him go. Of course, it was cruel, but there was some kind of justice. And in the long run, he was acquitted. He worked in Algiers and in several other countries, and he clearly achieved a lot. But by the time my father struck a close acquaintance with him because of a trip to Finland and other countries of the Baltic, Mikhailov then head of one of the departments in the Izvestia newspaper, was the head of the delegation of which my father was a member, and they struck a close acquaintance. And since then, when Mikhailov was at loose ends, that same fate befell the entire generation of the 1920s, which was at the time being pushed aside. He had lots of spare time, and he mostly spent it listening to different broadcasts of foreign radio stations in the languages he knew. And he took notes which documented in quite a few details the events in the world. We lived in what is now called informational vacuum. Newspapers printed very little of what was really going on in the world. The entire preparation for the impending Second World War remained virtually unknown to us. But he knew it all, and he regularly visited us at home, once a week, once every 2 weeks, but it was systematic. And he would look into his notes and he would tell me and my father a sort of digest. Apparently, he thought it his duty. I know he also visited Leonov's, some other writers. He wanted to do something at the time, but what could he do? He could only enlighten those people who, in his opinion, might be significant for the future of the country, for the future of the world. And probably it was very sensible. He impressed me with his personality, with his stories of what he had gone through. His entire life was the life of a heroic man, a kind of Hemingway-esque character. He told me that as a young man, a student, he was drafted to the Russian army, to that part that fought the Turkish army in Mesopotamia, in what is now Iraq, in what was then a part of the Ottoman Empire. He told about the hardships of the desert. They had no water, they had to drink their own urine. Those details produced a great impression on the imagination of a boy. And it was very interesting for me to see what a real man should be like, fighting for his country in different countries and so on. I think his example was useful, and what was really important that, like my father, I really knew what was going on, and in that sense we were an exception. It's surprising, but the milieu around us lived in that vacuum and didn't really suffer. People knew almost nothing about what was going on, and it helped them, because to a degree they didn't know the entire horror of the coming days. On the other hand, it's horrible because the war came as a terrible blow, as a shock people weren't ready for. The entire country was, not only some soldiers at the border. No one knew what was going on. The leaders didn't know either, as we know now. But it was the common state, and we were an odd exception, which was, in a way, very difficult. I remember that feeling of knowing something that is going to happen, and people around you don't know. Later, the situation was repeated in other maybe more serious cases in my life. They were serious because there was the need to help somehow, to communicate to others that a danger exists. I will maybe speak about it later. I became very concerned with the fact that the humankind should be saved, and very few people are doing it. I didn't go to school much. It so happened that because of my illness, I only went to the 5th grade. That was right before the war. And in that 5th grade, I did attend school for a year, even if with several absences because of minor illnesses. Then we were evacuated. I had typhus there, so I had very little time, literally days, that I spent at school. What was very important for me, and I'm not boasting, is just about measuring one's strength. Because of the evacuation and the move, I missed the 6th grade. And my mother, in a somewhat madcap spirit, went to the principal of a Tashkent school and said that I had attended the 6th grade in another city. There is no paperwork because we had been evacuated. She did it because she wanted me to go to the 7th grade. It meant I had to have known algebra and geometry for the 6th grade to pass some tests in these subjects. About a week after her talk to that principal, I remember well the day I spent with the school books in algebra and geometry. Frankly speaking, I did take a peek in them a long time ago in my early education. I learned everything in the span of a week. In fact, in a day, and I came to this 7th grade, and our math teacher praised me highly. And of course, he had no doubts about my having been to the 6th grade, and showed me different things. On the one hand, one could do a lot during one's life. On the other hand, school education is good for nothing, because it makes one spend a lot of time on things that can be done very quickly. Later, I had conflicts with the math teacher, too, at a very good Moscow school, which I attended, and the conflicts were precisely for the very reason. They thought I had good abilities, but I applied them in the wrong direction. I spent more time in writing poetry and didn't work much on home assignments. And as they said, I lived off my previously accumulated knowledge. It spared me the need to cram. I knew a lot, and what I did not know I could prepare quickly. But the schools, both in Tashkent and later in Moscow, were marvelous. Very good teachers who were interested in various ways. One of the biology lessons was almost incredible for me. We had a biology teacher, a regular Soviet teacher, unlike many others, because it was wartime Moscow with few schools, and like many others, a party member. I know it well because he kept going to the district party committee. He would tell us about it. He was known to be active in the party. Just imagine, the year is 1944. We're having a lesson on Darwinism. He comes to us and says, today our lesson is dedicated to a wonderful Soviet biologist, to Nikolai Ivanovich Vavilov, whom he knew well. And he tells us about how much Vavilov did. Among other things, Vavilov collected a huge number of seeds from various plants to do what had already been done in many countries, but not in Russia, to have a green revolution, to find plants necessary for ecology, for the environment. He told us about Vavilov's different practical and theoretical outstanding achievements. And when I learned later that at the time Vavilov was dying in prison in Saratov, I was shocked because, first of all, our teacher must have trusted that tremendously. It would have been enough for one of us to tell to a wrong person, and our teacher could have had horrible trouble. And second of all, he really liked Vavilov very much, and he wanted, apparently, having learned of Vavilov's fate, to express it somehow. It was a display. And our literature teacher also did something like that. She taught us outside the curriculum. We studied the symbolists, the poets who weren't in the curriculum. The curriculum was less strict, but it did include certain obligatory 20th century writers. And she taught us quite a bit more. And I had very good relations with her. She appreciated my compositions. I still have some of them. Of course, they were not at all in the required spirit of the time. There was no politics there, but their ideology was wrong. She was quite okay with that. What was remarkable as well was the students who attended that school. It rarely happened so, but there were many remarkable people who later shined. My close friend at school was Valentin Yanin, the head of the Novgorod expedition, a wonderful Russian archaeologist. We spent a lot of time together then. It so happened we attended some lectures together. He studied at the division for history. I studied at the division for philology. And we attended together lectures of Marxism, which we didn't listen to. Instead, in the communist room, which had the non-communist subjects quite a bit. There were a few more people. And on the whole, it was a very strong school. I think 12 students out of a class of 20 people graduated with honors. That is, almost all of us could apply for university admission without examination. That was a peculiar school in the wartime Moscow, when the teachers are select, and to some degree the students are select too. I'm afraid to generalize to say that Soviet schools were always like that. But I was lucky. I was lucky in life in general, but in particular I was very lucky at school. And then I was lucky at the university also, because of wonderful professors and because of the remarkable fortune of being in the same year with several people who became my closest lifelong friends, with whom we did a lot together. I want to say a few things about the division for philology. Two different but propitious circumstances. First, really many wonderful professors and instructors. Most important of them was Mikhail Nikolaevich Peterson, who was my professor starting with the second year. I found him in the following way. There was a paper on the wall, and it had a handwritten message in a very precise handwriting. Students wishing to study Sanskrit meet at 9 a.m. at such and such room. It's a very complicated situation. Sanskrit is not prescribed, but it's an ancient language of India. It's important for several branches of the humanities, not for linguistics only. But in linguistics, it's being used for comparing languages. And according to a Soviet dogma which was being introduced at the time, comparing languages was incorrect. It's a bourgeois pseudoscience. And even though the idea was being introduced, it wasn't introduced energetically enough for people to obey it. And my professor, Mikhail Nikolaevich Peterson, continued to work in Sanskrit and comparative linguistics just as he did in his younger days. It is a very interesting Russian family, by the way. Peterson must be of some German, Scandinavian origin. Their great-great-grandfathers became Russified, so they were a perfectly Russian family. Mikhail Nikolaevich Peterson's father was the chief executor of the great Russian religious philosopher Fedorov, who put forward the idea of the common cause. He wrote the book, The Philosophy of the Common Cause. Common cause is what scientists must be made to work on. Science should have a higher goal in order not to destroy the humankind, but on the contrary to do good. That common cause is the resurrection of the dead, physical resurrection of the dead, something like today's cloning. But it is to be a physical resurrection, such as to be achieved through the joint scientific efforts, and efforts must be expended on it. I will digress slightly, but I will tell you a thing which I think is of startling interest, of the origins of Tsiolkovsky and Russian infatuation with space. Tsiolkovsky was a deaf boy. He couldn't attend school. There were no hearing aids at the time. And the teacher said they couldn't shout loud enough for him to hear them. Fedorov was then the keeper of the Rumyantsev Museum. Today he would be called the head librarian of the Lenin's library. The Rumyantsev Museum was housed in the Pashkov house, which has still fallen apart, unfortunately. Tsiolkovsky came there as a boy, and he tells Fedorov, "This is the way things are. I'm deaf, and I cannot attend school, but I know you're a librarian. You could select books for me, and I would study with you using these books. Mostly I will study mathematics and physics." Fedorov asked him a few questions. He realized it was a very gifted boy and said, "You will live here with me." And Fedorov lived right among the books. "And I will give you a stipend out of my own salary. And I will teach you using these books. But for that, you have to solve a preliminary problem. The central task for all scientists is to resurrect the dead. But when the dead are resurrected, they will have to be settled somewhere. Earth will not be able to hold them all. Just imagine all those millions of people that have ever lived. They will all be resurrected. We have to conquer other planets. And you will have to work on it." And Tsiolkovsky promised him to do it, and he worked on it, and that's how our space conquest started. Peterson, my professor's father, was Fedorov's executor. He was faithful to Fedorov. In the Soviet time, these ideas weren't popular, as you can imagine. Tsiolkovsky was recognized because the necessity for the space was apparent. Even then, it was clear that the military could use rockets too. But by the time, Fedorov's archive had to be saved. And imagine that in the communal apartment where Mikhail Nikolaevich spent his entire life, the Fedorov archives was saved. And later, when times changed, it was given to the Lenin's library. Thus the archive was saved. It's one of the many examples. I give you examples of incredible actions by people I met. Today, many people think that everybody was scared out of their mind, everybody behaved improperly. Nothing of the sort. The Russian intelligentsia survived. So here is the first class on Sanskrit with Mikhail Nikolaevich. He's a small, very energetic person, always with a spring in his step. He begins to read Sanskrit texts with us, and then he begins to give us lectures on comparative linguistics. And in the meantime, situation becomes darker. It's the time after the war, and everything that was being permitted for a short while is now being persecuted. The newspaper Culture Live was being published at the time, and people would say it was not culture and it wasn't life either. We were subscribed to that Culture and Life newspaper. I always got up early, and before going to the university, I take that newspaper out of the mailbox. And one morning, I opened the newspaper and read an article which says that my professor Mikhail Nikolaevich Peterson is a fascist, no more, no less. The grounds for the statements are entirely ridiculous. He quoted a German scholar whose books were published in Germany in the beginning of Hitler's time. But at the time, scholarly books were published too. That scholar had nothing to do with fascists. Naturally, it was known Peterson was initially set up in that way. And I'm thinking, what's going to happen? We have a class at 9. I'm coming to that class, and he walks in with the usual spring in his step. He certainly must have read that article, but he never let us know he read it. He joked with us, etc. He managed to teach us different languages. He taught us Sanskrit, Lithuanian, comparative grammar of Indo-European languages. He taught us all those semi-prescribed sciences. In the meantime, times changed, and he could take us, a small group of his students, onto the graduate school, and everything went well in that respect. Now I will speak something about that group of students. That was the most extraordinary bit of luck that, in the year when I entered, several people entered the university too, with shared interests. For instance, we all studied Sanskrit and all those linguistic things, and not only. We were at different departments, but we found each other quite soon. My closest friend with whom I continue to work still is Vladimir Nikolaevich Toporov. He is a Russian academician now and famous throughout the world. We wrote several books and articles together. We did a lot together in general. And our friendship started at our first year in the university, and it continues throughout our lives. So it's quite remarkable in that sense that we did find each other, that we had similar views of things. For us both, it was equally clear that the regime was atrocious, that we had to construct our lives in separation from that regime, without giving in and without compromising. It was all clear. We discussed it all with each other, and we had tons of various interests we shared in literature. For instance, we all adored Pasternak. For instance, in that circle of ours, not only Toporov and me were there. Some other mutual friends, boys and girls, knew Pasternak's early book, My Sister Life. We could recite it in the very order in which the poems were published, without omitting a single one. It was a sort of a sign, you know, as in a Masonic lodge, a sign that you belong to the same group. I think it was an extraordinary fortune that at the time we were so lucky to have found each other. Of course, compared to others, we looked isolated, to put it mildly. There were many snitches among our fellow students. We knew that. They didn't even hide it all that much. Not that we were warned, but we knew that there were quite a few people who could do the wrong thing. And we had to be careful. That is, a certain game with the KGB was already on, in the sense that we knew we had to observe certain care and rules for clandestine behavior. But life could be lived on with these rules observed. And now I think of the university years as of the time when we managed to do a lot.